Good morning. Congratulations to everybody for hanging in here. We've got one more day to go. I'm going to try to do this in 45 minutes. Just to preface this a little bit, I want to thank the SOF. What I'm about to show you is a result of a project made available through money that has been put into this by the SOF. The proposal was put to me to do a series of books, one per year, that are going to mainly consist of gathering and republishing material that has been printed in the past that can be more readily accessible if we bring it together in a series of thematically oriented books. The next one, the second one, and so this is to invite any of you that could provide input into this, is going to be on the authorship question and education. And it will be available before the 2019 National Association of English Teachers Conference, which is going to be in Baltimore, that Shelley is putting together a proposal that we have a presence at. So that will be one of the resources that we have to hand out there. The first one that we're doing, and as you can see, it exists already in proof form. It's not going to be available for sale for another month or so because we need to go over it, but it already has a physically tangible form. This is a collection of Oxford's poetry, assembled with evidence showing that these poems are the juvenilia of Shakespeare. You all have, there's two handouts, so that's something you can refer to as I talk, and you can take with you. So with that as an introduction, so let's see some hands here. How many of you have heard that the Earl of Oxford wasn't Shakespeare because he was a terrible man? Alan Nelson's favorite talking point. Shakespeare, of course, was a wallflower. How about he died in 1604, long before the plays were written? Okay? And how about he was a bad poet? Now, that's what this book is about. This book is aerodynamic enough and heavy enough that if you need to, you can throw it at the person who says that. But you know, more productively, maybe you just hand it to them and say, maybe you should read. So,
says his juvenilia was mediocre.
Who, Shakespeare or?
Yes.
Oh, well,
Oxford.
Well, that's because it was juvenilia, right? That's yeah. Okay. So here's a question: why don't Stratfordians say this about the De Vere letters? They don't say, "Look at what an awful letter writer he was." Well, here's the answer. Well, there's several answers. The first is this is a very awkward argument for the Stratfordian to make because, of course, they don't have any letters. And here are some facts about letters. Letters appear as significant plot elements in at least 32 of the canonical plays. And scholars who study these letters will tell you that Shakespeare was the most talented letter writer in the Elizabethan age. No one thought to keep a letter that he wrote? This is his letter, the last letter he wrote, I believe, to King James about the Waltham Forest. Quite a remarkable letter. Part of what interests me about this letter is notice the graphic element of obeisance at the end here. Your Majesty's most humble subject and servant. So there's quite a remarkable ability here to translate a sort of a position vis-a-vis the monarch in the letter. So a lot of the work has already been done for us here. Basically, what this book does is it takes an argument that John Thomas Looney already made in 1920 and 1921 and puts some stronger evidence behind it. He stated in 1921, well, in some cases even in Shakespeare Identified, but then also in this book that came out a year later, that poems printed as by Ignoto and Shepard Tony in a volume called England's Helicon that we're going to take a look at in just a minute, and also song lyrics from John Lyly's plays that are printed for the first time in 1632, were by Oxford. He did not, although he wrote a preface suggesting some reasons why, I don't think he fully explored or brought to bear all the evidence that we can now see to back him up. So essentially, there are two major precedents to what we're doing here. I mentioned the letters. How many people are familiar with this book by William Plumer Fowler? Fabulous. To me, this was one of the books that when I first saw it in about 1991, just floored me. This is obviously not a book that you would sit down and read from start to finish, but if you spend any amount of time with it and look at the examples that he has accumulated here, it's pretty clear eventually that you're dealing with the same mind at work. So I wanted to do what Fowler did with the letters with these poems. So here are some problems that are answered by the solutions proposed in this book. Where is Shakespeare's Juvenilia? Don't let anybody tell you that Venus and Adonis is Shakespeare's Juvenilia. That is just nonsense. That shows they don't know the poem very well. Where is De Vere's Missing Comedy? Okay, we know he had a reputation as a fine comic writer. And what should we do with the very large number of unattributed or doubtfully attributed lyric poems of Elizabethan vintage? And there are a lot of them, especially, I want to emphasize, in the songbooks. The published music books of the Elizabethan age almost never attribute lyrics to particular writers. Therefore, the default among scholars of the age is that the lyrics were written by the composer, who usually is acknowledged in the book. But I think that is a dangerous and inaccurate assumption. So how did I go about doing this work? There are two main resources that I used. This one is available to all of us, and I want to recommend this if you're not familiar with it. This is open source Shakespeare, and it's published by MIT online, and you can search any word or phrase or combination of words or phrases either throughout the entire Shakespeare canon, in a particular play, or you can even, with this drop down here, you can pick a particular character and examine the speech patterns of individual characters. So this is a very useful resource. You can do Boolean searches, which means you can put in an operator like one word and another word, or but, or to really fine-tune what you're doing. The other source that I used, which is unfortunately not readily accessible to most people, but I want to let you know what it is called Early English Books Online. You can only access this if you're affiliated with a university, or you have a friend or a spouse who is affiliated with a university, in my case, who has access to this. It's an amazing source. It includes more than 125,000 texts published in England during those dates. And that means it has electronic versions of all of those books. And it also has an expanding searchable plain text database where you can also search for individual words or phrases. Now, I want to emphasize that in searching this, it's not 100% perfect. There are going to be some things that do not show up that should, but from my experience, you get 85 or 90% of what's out there during a particular time period. Now, you can limit your search by time. Most of the searches that I did for this book, I did 1473 to 1623, because I wanted to eliminate things that could clearly and obviously be merely echoes of the plays, which became even more widely available, of course, than before in 1623 when the folio was published. So this is the kind of thing that we begin to see. Interestingly enough, you wouldn't find this in a word search. But in Looney's 1921 book on the poems, this was one of the comparisons that really impressed me. So here is a short 6-line poem published in a volume called England's Parnassus in 1593, attributed to E of Ox. It goes like this: What plague is greater than the grief of mind? The grief of mind that eats in every vein that leaves such clods behind, such clods behind as breed such bitter pain that none shall ever find. What plague is greater than the grief of mind? This is actually a literary figure. It's the literary figure of anadiplosis, in which the trick is to repeat the second half of the line in the first half of the next line and still keep some forward momentum in the verse so that you have a kind of continuous logic. Now listen to Comedy of Errors. She is so hot because the meat is cold. The meat is cold because you come not home. You come not home because you have no stomach. You have no stomach, having broke your fast. But we know what it is to fast and pray, are penitent for your default today. Exactly the same literary figure, 6 lines. Notice the difference is interesting. The first one has a very strict rhyme scheme. The rhyme scheme in the Shakespeare version is a little looser here. This one comes much closer to natural speech. This is the evolution of Shakespeare as a poet. He begins by mastering rather rigid closed forms and is interested in the way people actually speak. And so there's definitely an evolution. I'm not going to try to tell you the first one seems as good poetry as the second, but the pattern is exactly the same. So before we go on, how might Stratfordians respond to this? So we have to recognize that the methodology used in this book is quite different. It's the methodology that Fowler used. Stratfordians these days use what they call stylometric study, where they pick one or a handful of features for comparison on the premise or the assumption that those features are somehow diagnostic of authorship. In some cases, this may be true or partly true. My favorite example of the ridiculousness of this, however, which I presented at a previous conference in a talk on Pericles, is that they have sometimes divided Pericles into Shakespeare and somebody else because the second half of Pericles uses the word sin 5 or 6 times, and the word sin does not appear in the first part of the play. Well, that's because the second part of the play, part of it occurs in a brothel. It has nothing to do with who wrote it. And yet this theory has been recycled numerous times over the last 20 years or so. So GIGO, anybody know what GIGO stands for? Garbage in, garbage out. So there is a real risk, and in some cases it's definitely true that what they're giving us is garbage in, garbage out. So what we do instead is we want to look at anything that could be connecting these two texts. Mostly vocabulary, but occasionally we find interesting examples where we see the same figures of speech going on, or we see the same syntactical patterns, the same types of ordering of elements of similar vocabulary, even if it is not identical. These are the different sections of the book. Part 1 is 20 canonical poems, and I'll break down for you in a minute what it is. Part 2 is other poems by Oxford. Then there are supplemental essays by Richard Waugeman, Gary Goldstein, Robert Prechter, Catherine Chiljon, and myself that cover various specific aspects of these problems. And then we have a bunch of appendices too. So let's see what these are. Oh, before I go on, I want to acknowledge this book by Kurt Kryler. One of the things that is not included, the major thing that is not included in this book, is I personally agree with Kurt Kryler that most of the poems in the 1575 volume 100 Sundry Flowers are by Oxford. I didn't include those for 2 reasons. One is there's a lot of them, and this already becomes nearly a 500-page book, and those poems are readily available, unlike most of these poems. And also, we have a little bit more of an uphill battle with those because they've already been accepted by Stratfordian scholars as the work of George Gascoigne. The poems that we're dealing with here, most of them do not really have any name clearly attached to them. There's some history of theorizing, but there's not going to be the same type of strong defense of the tradition the way we are going to get with Hundred Sundry Flowers. This book came out in 2013. It has the poems in both German and English. So it was a wonderful introduction, I think, especially to German speakers to Oxford as a poet. So the first section, Brian Wildenthal put in a tremendous amount of time working with me to edit the first section. The poem that you have there, your first handout from Cardanus Comfort, that is the first of the 20 canonical poems. And I gave you the whole entry on it so you can see how these are set up and what kinds of evidence we bring to bear. If we break down these poems by where they first appeared, that first one is from Cardanus Comfort in 1572. Then there are 8 that were published in Paradise of Dany Devices that we've already seen discussed. 2 were published anonymously in William Byrd's Songs and Sonnets in 1588 and subsequently attributed with some confidence to Oxford. 6 are known only in manuscript sources, 1 from the Phoenix Nest in 1593. Interestingly enough, so 3 of the total were published in songbooks. This is not Anthony Munday. I think it's John Munday. Munday's Songs and Psalms, 1595. And 1 in England's Helicon, where it is attributed to Ignoto. Okay, this is an interesting hint or clue here, and it's attributed in manuscript to Oxford and also to Churchyard, but we'll get to that. So that's the first section. This is Paradise of Dany Devices. This is the most important early poetry anthology in the Elizabethan age. There are 8 poems in the first edition with the initials EO after them. There are also a number of anonymous poems in this book, and as more editions of it came out, I forgot to put the number down here. It's something like around 8 editions. It's a large number of editions come out over the next 20 years or so. It's more often reprinted than any other poetry anthology. Modern scholars are mystified at why it was so popular. I think we know the answer. I think Oxford's poems and the other poems in this volume were very popular. So we've been conservative here. We're not including a number of poems in here that were anonymous that I think are probably by him. We're only including the EO ones. And this book was the main source of Oxford's reputation as a lyric poet. So I put up on the screen here, I gave you a handout on the first of these 20 poems. This is the last of them. This is sometimes called In Peas Cod Time. That's the first line. In peas cod time, when hound to horn gives ear, while buck is killed, is the first line here. This is one of the most intriguingly complex ones. Stephen May only classifies this as probably or possibly by Oxford. And that's because it appears in 1580 in a volume of poems put out by Thomas Churchyard. Now, even Stephen May admits that Churchyard and Oxford were tight as 2 peas in a pod over a long period of time. So the fact that this is attributed in manuscript to Oxford suggests to me that Oxford did write it, and he was swapping poems with Churchyard and probably said, sure, you can put that in your book if you want to. The same poem appears in 1600 as by Ignoto. So this is just a summary of what the whole entry on this poem looks like. So the phrase peas cod time is kind of interesting because when you look that up in Ebo, 1473 to 1623, you only get 3 hits in 3 records. 2 of those are to published versions of this poem, and 1 is to 2nd Henry IV. Now, I want to stress that that level of precision is not available for a lot of the parallelisms in this book, but our collection of the ones that are like this is probably not complete. but when I felt there was a good chance that we might be able to narrow the search field a little bit, I have tried to supply that. And so for comparison, Igbo contains from 1470, that should be 73, excuse me, 1473 to 1630, approximately close to 8,000 separate documents. So when something appears in only 3 of them, and one of them is to 2 references to Shakespeare, and the third one is to a poem attributed, at least in some sources, to Oxford, I think in that one example, we are illustrating a significant finding. So, bless you. The next group are poems from the Passionate Pilgrim in 1599. And as you can see on the title page here, this is a book published by William Jagger, who is the father of Isaac Jagger, of the firm that eventually is going to publish the folio 24 years later. And it's attributed to Shakespeare. I don't know that Orthodox scholars have ever asked the question, and it took me a while to ask it myself, who is the Passionate Pilgrim? This is a title that invokes seemingly a person, an individual. Who would the Passionate Pilgrim be? Now, Stratfordians don't like this book very much. Most of them, and they say, although it says by W. Shakespeare on the title page, they only accept 5 out of 20 poems published in this volume as being by Shakespeare. And I'm indebted here to Catherine Children's leadership on this point. Her article that we reprint in the volume basically says, let's take the other 15, okay, and see what happens. So that's what we've tried to do to reclaim the other 15 poems. Song lyrics from John Lyly's plays. This one is fascinating. As many of you know, Lyly's plays began being published in quarto in the early 1590s. And the quartos, however, have about 20 places where there's supposed to be a song, and there was a song in the original production, and they don't print the song. This is a little bit hard to read, but this is from Endymion. It says, enter fairies, but what are these so fair friends that cause my hairs to stand upright and spirits to fall down? Hags out, alas, nymphs, I crave pardon, I me, what do I hear? And then there's a stage direction. The fairies dance, and with a song, pinch him, pinch Endymion. That might remind you of the fairies pinching Falstaff. It's a presage of that, an earlier version of it. And with a song, they kiss Endymion and depart. There's no song printed in the quarto. There's no songs at all printed in any of the quartos. We only have the songs because when Edward Blount printed Lyly's collected works in 1632, they were added back in. So Looney said, we know that these two collaborated. And I don't remember who said at a previous conference a year or two ago, they don't seem, Stratfordians are all about collaboration, right? This is one of the most important collaborations in the period, well documented. They have no curiosity about it, apparently. So Looney said they're by Oxford. We might rephrase that in the form of a riddle. Why print the plays and leave out the songs? Again, Looney was almost 100 years ahead of us here, right? Finally, here we have poems by Ignoto in England's Helicon. This is published originally in 1600. There are 11 Ignoto poems. Ignoto just means the unknown one. There are 11 published in 1600, 17 in 1614. There were 9 or 10 poems added, of which 6 of the new ones are attributed to Ignoto. And there's not a lot of subsequent discussion of their authorship after Looney attributed them to Oxford. There are, as we shall see, a couple of other theories, but nobody's really gone to bat in a heavy way on it. So this is what Looney said about Ignoto in 1921. These poems link the early de Vere poetry and the later Shakespearean work. R. Warwick Bond, the editor biographer of Lyly, who is amply supported by Sir Sidney Lee, establishes very clearly the connection between Shakespeare and what he conceives to be Lilly's special contribution to Elizabethan drama and poetry, and he concludes by suggesting that certain Ignoto poems were probably from Lilly's pen. We may repeat that Lilly was a servant of the Earl of Oxford, and it is credited with achievements both in drama and poetry, which we believe to have been those of his master. And it is this which links itself up with the Shakespeare work. We may claim indirect authority of Mr. Bond for the theory we present respecting the Ignoto poems. The appearance of Oxford's hand in England's Helicon, together with his relationship to the personalities for whose names Ignoto furnishes quite appreciable support to the theory. Oops, I think I went the wrong way. Or I have, let's see, yeah, I guess I got an extra version of that. All right. So we're almost done with the overview here. Interestingly enough, Looney did not know, because he did not have the research tools that we now have available, that there are other poems by Ignoto from the Elizabethan period. And I, building on work that Richard Waugeman has already done, in this book we present 7 of these poems, which to my knowledge, I believe this book contains every poem ever published under the name Ignoto. And that is important because you will hear it said that, oh, everybody was writing, that just means, you know, anonymous. It doesn't just mean anonymous. These poems, these 17 plus 7, 20, what is that, 24 poems, at least to my ear, have a continuity that suggests that they're all by one person, and that when they're ascribed to Ignoto, the people who did that ascription knew what they were doing. So interestingly, 3 of them are dedicatory poems to Spencer, a man named Robert Toff, and to the Phoenix and the Turtle. That's not the right title. Is Catherine here? What's the, no, okay. Love's Martyr, thank you. Yes, Love's Martyr. I needed to edit that, and I didn't get around to it. There's one in a volume, John Davies' Epigrams and Elegies from 1590, and 3 in Francis Davison's Poetical Rhapsody in 1602. No new Ignoto poems, according to the EBO search that I did, appear after that time. It doesn't continue being used. And then finally, there are a few miscellaneous, anonymous, and pseudonymous poems that appear in curious and interesting contexts, including 6 dedicatory poems to other works, 2 of which appear in Johnson's Sejanus in 1605. And we obviously don't have time to read this, but notice the signature here, the subscription. Cygnus means the swan. To Johnson's Sejanus in 1605. And then 3 poems that we're going to look at a little more closely in Anthony Munday's 1619 Primaleon, which is a prose romance of the sort that Mundy specialized in. And we have a big surprise on that. Your second handout, if you turn to the second page, is the version that appears published in Prima Leon in 1619. The poem earlier appears, which is your first page, as by Shepard Tony in England's Helicon. So the book has over 1,700 footnotes, and the primary purpose of the footnotes is to illustrate parallelisms of vocabulary, syntax, or idea between the poems and canonical Shakespeare texts. Most of these, if you pick an individual one, you will find appearing in lots of other sources. What is important here is the accumulation of parallelisms within a fairly short space in the literary work. And as you can see, the footnotes are pretty dense here. This is from one of the Lilly songs. And the other thing I want to point out here that was fascinating to me, because I didn't understand this before I did this, these Lilly songs are operatic. They're not songs that are sung by one character. They're songs that are sung with different lines attributed to different characters. This, to my knowledge, is the first time in England anyone ever did this. I suspect it was done earlier in Italy and France. I don't know that for sure, but I suspect. So the secondary purpose of the notes is to provide interpretive glosses for difficult words, and we try to do that. So then there's a section on supplemental essays. I already mentioned this. Richard Waugeman, who many of you know, but some of you may not, is a mainstay of our Oxfordian groups on the East Coast. Is a psychoanalyst, a very well-known and well-respected psychoanalyst in the Washington, D.C. area. And so we actually have 3 articles by him. These all are attributions to other poems, including one additional poem that was added to the 1578 edition of the Paradise of Dany Devices. Let's see. How am I doing on time? I got another. I want to finish in 40. How am I? Right. Okay. So quickly on this. When I say that these poems furnish the foreground and the rough drafts of what Shakespeare is later going to do, this is one of my favorite examples of this. On the right-hand side, we have Ignato's poem. This is a long poem in which it's a very bawdy poem. It's very erotic. And it has these lines early on. I love thee not for unchaste luxury, nor for thy body's fair proportion. I am not fashioned for these amorous times, to court thy beauty with lascivious rhymes. I cannot dally, caper, dance, and sing, oiling my saint with supple sonneting. I cannot cross my arms or sigh, ay me, forlorn, egregious foppery. And as I read that, I was thinking, I've heard this before. Well, this is where I heard it. Now notice what's happened here. This is the first-person voice of the lyric poet, really actually going way beyond the bounds of normal Elizabethan decorum. There's a lot of very overt sexual imagery in this poem. And in this poem, it's the woman, it's the desired object who has the fair proportion in her body. What Shakespeare has done is to take this lyric poem and reassemble the elements of it by creating a character, Richard III, who lacks fair proportion. And so here, he's saying, I can't match your fair proportion. And Richard III says, I am not shaped. Notice the series of negations is the same in both passages. I am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court with amorous looking glass. I am rudely stamped, and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nip. I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, same phrase, cheated of feature, by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world scarce half made up, and so lamely and unfashionable that the dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Okay? So the raw materials for this are already present in Ignoto. So if I have time to do this, I want to move on now to a slightly different aspect. We've been looking at the issue of the parallelisms between Shakespeare and these poems. That's what I set off wanting to do, was to assemble that evidence in one book. What I was not expecting was what I next found, which is that it appears to me that the editors of England's Helicon and probably some of the other poetry anthologies knew perfectly well what they were doing when they used these Ignoto ascriptions. I unexpectedly discovered a set of independent proofs in the form of Elizabethan editorial practices and statements suggesting that the editors of the volumes in which these poems appear were fully aware of the authorship question and intended their subtle efforts to identify de Vere as the author to be recovered by posterity. I'm actually going to skip by this one just because I'm a little bit short on time. I want to get to the most important of these. Okay, so let's talk about this Colin Clout poem. You have this one, okay? Colin Clout, of course, is Edmund Spenser. Now, here's a curious thing. Why does Shakespeare never write a poem for Edmund Spenser? In fact, Shakespeare is invisible in the important social network of early modern poets. You got other people to write dedicatory poems to your play, as we saw in Johnson's Sejanus. This was a big deal. Shakespeare never participates in this. He doesn't get these dedicatory poems, and he doesn't give them. But Ignoto, or actually, I'm sorry, Shepard Tony, actually both Ignoto and Shepard Tony play this game a lot. So to Colin Clout, i.e. Spenser, this is widely hailed as the best poem that Shepard Tony ever wrote. And there is a tradition identifying Shepard Tony as Antony Munday, and I'm going to show you why that's baloney. So E.H. Bowen edited two versions in the 19th century of England's Helicon. In the first one, he said, Shepard Tony cannot be Monday because this is very thin gruel. There's not even a passable lyric in Monday's Banquet of Dany Cacetes. The collection is on that account important as affording excellent proof that Antony Munday was not Shepard Tony. That's what he wrote in 1887. Then in 1889, he said, this charming lyric was written by the Shepard Tony, Antony Munday. And that opinion was echoed very forcefully in 1920 by M. St. Clair Byrne in an MLA article. Well, why do they say that? This is what you have in your handout. Notice anything interesting about that? Who does Munday attribute this song to? It's in a book with his name on it, but he attributes it to Prince Edward. There are 3 songs in Monday's book attributed to Prince Edward, one of which was previously attributed to Shepard Tony. Well, why do they say they're so sure that it's Monday? Well, Claire St. Byrne says Shepard Tony poems are terrible except for one. That's the one I just gave you. He says this is a great poem. They have to admit that because it's been widely reprinted and widely admired. It's because that poem is reprinted in Pre-Malayan. Therefore, they say Monday was Shepard Tony. There's a real absence of intellectual curiosity here. It is assumed that a poem published in a book attributed to a particular author is by that author. I'm not going to try to read this whole slide here because I'm going to move things along, but this is Sir Sidney Lee. What Sidney Lee is saying in this slide is that poems circulated in manuscript, and people collected them, and the names of the original authors were very frequently mixed up and confused, and so you cannot determine anything really by the published ascriptions alone. These poetry anthologies emerged out of this manuscript tradition and culture. So here's the interesting thing about Pre-Malayan that we were never told. It is dedicated to who? Henri de Vere, 18th Earl of Oxford. Sorry, that should say 18th. And to that most noble Earl, your father, of famous and desertful memory, for you being the true heir to your honorable father's matchless virtues. And I will tell you that the word virtue is actually can't read it myself here, but it's at the end of a line. So you get VER hyphen, and the rest of it continues on the next line. I really suspect that's quite intentional. And succeeding him in place of degree and eminency, who should inherit the father's trophies, monuments, and ancient memories, but his truly noble and virtuous second appearance of virtuous son, in whom old Lord Edward is still living. There's a second epistle in this book to the general reader, which refers to his intent, Monday's intent, to complete the whole history of Prince Edward of England and that of his son, Prince Pomeron. So there's a perfect mapping in these two dedications. The first one is about the son and the father, and now he's saying, my book is about the son and the father is Prince Edward here. So, great, 10 minutes, we'll make it. So I'm going to move on to Passionate Pilgrim and England's Helicon. Oh, 5 minutes, okay? We have 3 poems in common in these 2 books, published 1 year apart. One of them, and all 3 are apparently attributed to Shakespeare in Passionate Pilgrim. Only one of those is attributed to Shakespeare in England's Helicon. And it is the poem that begins, on a day, alack the day. It's the only poem in England's Helicon attributed to Shakespeare. The other 2, which immediately follow the attribution to Shakespeare, are attributed to Ignoto, despite the fact that they were attributed a year earlier to Shakespeare. Now, why would the editors of England's Helicon do that? And have they told us anything else that might be useful in helping us to answer that question? Okay. Well, I want to finish. Okay. I want to finish in time for some conversation. So, this poem, I was tempted to give you a handout on this one, and I didn't do it, but it's up on Shakespeare, actually. And I've edited the notes. Originally, the one I published on Shakespeare was needed a little bit of work, but this is the only poem attributed to Shakespeare in England's Helicon, and it is printed 3 times in between the earliest, in the Elizabethan period. There's 1 or 2 other poems of Shakespeare that are also printed 3 times. Originally, I thought this was clearly the most reprinted, but it's one of them. There's no other poem of Shakespeare's, no other lyric poem that is printed more than 3 times in the Elizabethan period. And I'm not going to go into the reading of this poem right now, but here's a little clue. There is a comic epiphany in it, I believe. And I'll let you find it on your own. So this is the second of the duplicates from Passionate Pilgrim. Interestingly, it was previously published in a songbook anonymously in Thomas Wilkes' songbook Madrigals to 3, 4, 5, and 6 voices. Now, some of you may know, I remember this, we haven't seen a lot about this recently, but there are scholars in our community who believe that Wilkes's songbooks was actually publishing Oxford's music. We know that Oxford was a widely respected musician, and like his plays, we don't really know where his music is. So I was quite interested to discover that this is where this first appeared. So it's first anonymous. So this is another one that comes out 3 times. First anonymous, then Passionate Pilgrim is by Shakespeare, and then England's Helicon by Ignoto. Can you see the title there? Oh, I gave it to you. It's called what? The Unknown Shepherd's Complaint. The third poem doesn't seem to be showing up here, but it is called Another of the Same Shepherds. Now, this one gets interesting because this is why Orthodox scholars do not attribute this to Shakespeare, because even though it's in Passionate Pilgrim, it appears a year earlier in a volume of verse by Richard Barnfield. Richard Barnfield, by the way, was you might call him the house poet of the Earl of Derby, and his first published book of poetry comes out in celebration of the marriage of Elizabeth Vere and Derby in 1595. So we have lots of reasons to believe that Barnfield is one of the people who would have been exchanging poems with the father-in-law of the Earl of Derby. But however, it is attributed by modern scholars to Barnfield. But why? This is my question for those modern scholars. They seem so certain they know the answer, but the editors of England's Helicon didn't attribute it to Barnfield. They have other poems by Barnfield, but this one they said is by Ignoto. Now, you can't read this, but I put this up here to show you. This is the dedication to the 1600 edition of England's Helicon, and it is reproduced in the volume in a more readable form. Can you see what the initials are here? They are LN. Now, this is widely acknowledged to be a reversal, which was a customary form of disguised authorship in this period. This is a reversal of the initials NL, standing for Nicolas Ling, the publisher of the first quarto of Hamlet, among a number of other Shakespearean play quartos. So this is Nicolas Ling here, one of the editors, and actually based on this introduction to The Reader If Indifferent is the title of the introduction. Based on this, he appears to have been the primary editor, even though there are other names associated with this publication. There's a lot of debate about who was the main editor, but I think that Ling has by far the best reason to be regarded as the editor, the primary editor. So this is, I've put in red here some of the key elements from this larger piece. He starts off, this is from the beginning, many honored names. So it's about honored names from the beginning, right? Many honored names have heretofore, in their particular interests, patronized some part of their inventions. If any man hath been defrauded of anything by him composed, by another man's title put to the same, so he's talking about attribution and the problems of attribution and knowing who wrote what, he hath this benefit by this collection, freely to challenge his own in public, where else he might be robbed of his proper due. Now, let's remember that this is a volume that includes a number of poems with ascriptions to definite poets known to be practicing, but at least 24, well, more than 24 of which are anonymous or pseudonymous. And he knows this perfectly well, of course. No one thing being placed by the collector of the same under any man's name, either at large or in letters, but as it was delivered by some especial copy coming into his hands. So first he says, if anybody's been done wrong, stand up and tell me who you were, and we will set it right. And then he goes out of his way to explain that he has inside sources and good data about who wrote what, okay? It was delivered, so either at large or in letters, but as it was delivered by some special copy coming into his hands. That's a very concrete image there, right? No one man that shall take offense that his name is published to any invention of his. Now he's talking about the stigma of print. Now he's talking about if I put your name on it and you didn't want me to put your name on it, okay? But he should, within a leaf or two, meet with another in reputation in every way equal to himself, whose name hath heretofore been printed to his palm. Now he knows that he's reprinting 3 lyrics that are from the Passionate Pilgrim. And I believe that this part is mainly about that very question. Why have I taken 3 poems that were attributed to Shakespeare and put Shakespeare's name on one of them and put Ignoto on the other 2? Okay, so another reputation every way equal to himself, whose name hath heretofore been printed to his poem, which now taken away were more than theft, which may satisfy him that would fain seem curious to be entreated for this same. Now, if any stationer shall find fault that his copies are robbed, okay, now he's talking about William Jagger, by anything in this collection, let me ask him this question: why more than this, than in any divine or human author? Further, if any man whatsoever, in prizing of his own birth or fortune, shall take it in scorn that a far meaner man in the eye of the world shall be placed by him. In other words, have his poem placed next to this other meaner individual. I tell him plainly, whatsoever so accepting, that that man's wit is set by his, not that man by him. Now, I cannot claim to entirely interpret all of this for you, but I think that we all can see that there's a lot going on here about the problem of the attribution of the poems in this volume. It's dense. These are the key points I draw from it. Persons of great honor have been poets. If anyone has been robbed because his work is published under another's name, he may challenge these now published attributions. However, I have special access to manuscript copy and accurate reports of attribution. If anyone of honor feels the stigma of print, he need only continue reading, and within a leaf or two, he will meet with a poet of equal stature and status. If any stationer feels robbed, I ask him why, in this case, should be any different from many similar instances of copying. I believe this is a direct allusion to Jagger's Passionate Pilgrim. And if any poet of status feels diminished by having his poems placed near those of meaner men, he should know that his association results from an equality of wit, not of persons. Now, this introduction was removed from the 1614 edition. In its place was put the table of all the songs and pastorals with the author's name contained in this book. So don't let anybody ever tell you that these people did not care about who wrote what. This is very carefully worked out. It's got a list of the songs here, and it's got a list of the authors here. And you can see actually a 19th or possibly, probably a 19th century reader has actually taken notes on this, because the reader was, it might have been George Stevens, I'm not sure, was going through and trying to fill in some of the enigmas here. Let's zoom in on a little piece of this. So here we have all three from Passionate Pilgrim a year before. We have W. Shakespeare followed by 2 of Ignoto. Those are the attributions. Let's look at the titles, which have been here clearly lined up and associated in the beginning of the book with those 3 names. The Passionate Shepherd's Song, the Unknown Shepherd's Complaint, and another of the same shepherds. Remember the thing about within a leaf or two, he shall find another of similar standing and status? That's what he's talking about right here. Okay, almost done here. One of the last things I did, having compiled this, and this will be updated once we finish adding a few more footnotes, I wanted to know, when we look for these parallels of vocabulary or syntax or idea, how does this data fall out? And I think the results are pretty stunning. Is there any reason why there should be 10 times as many references in this book to Venus and Adonis than Henri VIII? If this is all just, everybody was using these words and phrases, I can think of none. It's not a perfect alignment, but in a general rough way, we start at the beginning and we have early poems and we work our way. Here's The Tempest, here's Macbeth, here's Othello, Merry Wives of Windsor maybe is a little bit out of place. So the first highest ones are Venus and Adonis and Lucrece, followed by Love's Labour's Lost, okay? Followed by 3rd Henry VI. And all 3 of the Henry VI plays appear in the top 10 here. So I think this is a confirmation that essentially what we're looking at when we read these poems is part of the evolution of the artistry that flourishes finally in the late works in its greatest form. And that's all I have for you.